So again, we've all loved Bob's different presentations, especially about the greater Louisville area, about things present and past. So I think this will be another very enjoyable talk. So Bob, I'll let you take it away, and thank you.
Louisville's forgotten railroad, and it really was forgotten. And I ran across the first reference to, I saw this on a map for years, didn't have a clue what it really was. And then one day I was in the old clippings file at the Louisville Free Public Library, which they no longer have. But anyway, I found some information on it, and that started me digging, doing some more digging and that sort of thing. One thing I will read slightly is General William Tecumseh Sherman, in his memoir, said, "The single stem of railroads supplied an army of 100,000 men and 32,000 horses for the period of 196 days between May 1st and November 19th, 1864. Now, he was talking about a stem of railroad that extended from Louisville, Kentucky to Atlanta, Georgia. Now, a key part of that railroad actually came through Louisville for a very short time. Let's see. Okay, this is Louisville right at the beginning of the Civil War. Also, before this time or about this time, the major transportation system in the United States was water. So the railroads were gradually replacing it. This shows a scene here at the Louisville Wharf of Union troops. I believe they were Wisconsin soldiers arriving at the wharf, and obviously came down by steamboats. But this showed you that this is the way a lot of the freight and personnel supporting the war mostly came in to Louisville and then would be transferred to trains. American Civil War could be called a railroad war. I guess the first war where railroads were really used was the Crimean War. And this sounds familiar, but anyway, it was between England and Russia over Crimea. So this has only been going on now for over 170 years. So anyhow, this particular picture was a lithograph of a rather freelanced idea of what a locomotive looked like, but it shows the picture. And what this actually is General Don Carlos Buell's army moving from Nashville to Louisville. So theoretically, what you're looking at is the soldiers marching on, which would be now 31W or Dixie Highway, and the trains were on the L&N. Lucky L&N, they managed to complete the railroad to Nashville in 1859, just about 2 years before the war started. You can see there's troops riding all over the trains, but this was important. What he was doing was, at the same time, a Confederate army had crossed into Kentucky, and their goal was to take Louisville and destroy the canal, among other things. Also, they had carloads of rifles to hand out to all these volunteers that were going to flock to join them. Well, when you say you're going to destroy stuff, and you take stuff and pay for it with money that nobody's quite sure what it's good for, you don't get too many volunteers. But anyway, this led to a battle and a lot of other things, which is another subject altogether. But it does show how important the railroad was, especially the stem between Nashville and Louisville. Okay, what was a railroad like in those days? If y'all remember, September, Bernie Kopinski gave a very good presentation on Civil War railroads. And he also discussed a lot of details about them. And also he modeled them. I'm not gonna give you any modeling information here. I think you can go back to YouTube if you have a chance, you want to see his presentation again. The primary locomotive used was the 440, also called the American wheel structure. And most of them were wood burning. Now, there was bigger locomotives in other sections of the country, but for the most part, this is what you were going to see pulling a train in the Civil War era. I think this particular picture was probably in Richmond, or well, it was in Virginia anyway. What was the rolling stock like? Well, it was pretty simple. Passenger cars usually had a platform at each end, maybe a clear story on top to provide some ventilation into the car, where little windows could be opened up. Again, the locomotive was a wood burning 440. If you notice the box car here to the side, right there, they didn't have brakes. There was no train brakes. Each car, normally the freight cars were normally a variation of a box car and a flat car. They add stuff to it. It could become a tank car or a gondola, but basically that was the two types of cars you had. A lot of them were ventilated because a lot of rolling stock or livestock had to be carried also. There you see a brake wheel on the car. They were all over the place. There was no AAR standards in those days, but a brakeman would have to run along the top of the train, spinning those brake wheels, because the only brakes on the train were on the locomotive. So he had to spin those brake wheels to get those cars to stop and slow down. This particular picture is at Hanover Junction, Pennsylvania. And it's kind of hard to see, but if you look in front of the window at the station, you barely make out a guy in a big top hat. Most historians agree that's Abraham Lincoln on his way to give the Gettysburg Address, because the train did come through there. Now, there's no real proof that it is, but how many tall guys in top hats would have been at Hanover Junction? So more likely it was Abraham Lincoln. What were railroads like in Louisville? Well, you had in the city itself, you had the Louisville and Frankfort Railroad, which actually also operated east of Frankfort as the Frankfort and Lexington Railroad. It was all one railroad, but it was operated as two separate railroads. Go figure. Like, get an idea how things went. And you had the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which went basically from 10th and Broadway to Nashville. In Jeffersonville, across the river, you had the Jeffersonville Railroad. And in New Albany, I listed here as the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago. It did not make it it never got to Louisville in those days. Back in, really by physically, it never got to Louisville. It had to come in on the K&I, or before that on the Pennsylvania. But anyway, it had finally made it to Michigan City, Indiana, because everyone knew Michigan City was going to be a much more important town than that place called Chicago. So now we know why there's no longer a Monon Railroad. But anyway, that was what you had serving the locality. Talk a little bit about them. The Louisville and Frankfort Railroad had a depot at Brook and Jefferson Street. So you figure that all day long, trains were running backwards and forward up and down Jefferson Street, out in the middle of the street. The other thing was the depot itself. I've never seen a picture of the depot, but I believe it was a covered depot of some sort, to where the cars could actually be backed into a doorway into the depot. In case you're wondering where that is today, it's an off ramp for I-65. So yeah,
we all know it as the old Haymarket.
Yep, there she be. When the railroad was told to get out of there in the 1870s, Louisville City wanted to get rid of those trains running up and down Jefferson Street. They moved down to the waterfront. At vacant land, suddenly all the farmers moved into it, and it became the Haymarket, which was there until basically the expressway took the Haymarket out. And a lot of people have fond memories of going over and buying their Christmas trees and buying their fresh vegetables and all that kind of stuff. The Jeffersonville Railroad was obviously across the river in Jeff, and there's a street there called New Market Street. If you're familiar with Jeffersonville today, that's Court Avenue. And so the railroad grounds today, if you go over there, it's the post office is in it, and the Jeffersonville Municipal Library is in it also. And across the street was those little buildings, it kind of indicates there, those were quartermaster warehouses for the bakery, but Warder Park is there in Jeffersonville now. So that the Jeffersonville Railroad went from there, and after having a brief battle with the Madison Railroad, it eventually made it to Indianapolis. So that was your connection there. Over on the New Albany side, you had the New Albany and Salem, later Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago, and it came to Pearl Street and Oak Street in New Albany. If you go there now, you'll see a caboose that's lettered Monon. Beware, it's really not a Monon caboose, but I think it was a nice gesture. But anyway, there's a crane company there now that's on the grounds of where they were. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad came in to Broadway at 10th Street. It's kind of a question is exactly where the depot was. This map shows the depot being along 10th Street on one side there, which I guess it could be. That later was turned into a freight depot, and it finally blew down in a windstorm in the 1970s. But the Civil War depot lasted for a long time there. The square of buildings went out at Delaware Street, which is now Breckenridge. Anyway, that was the shops for the L&N Railroad. This all connected into a system of different railroads that kind of podged together that took you down to Nashville, over through Chattanooga to Dalton, and eventually down to Atlanta. What's different is this looks like a railroad network. There was no such thing as a railroad network. Each railroad built from some place to another place. They really didn't care about other railroads or where they were or anything else, but eventually they did start connecting together. Of the 4 railroads I mentioned in the city, what they they all had a different track gauge from the others. The Lexington Railroad had a 4-foot 8.5-inch track gauge because they bought a locomotive from England, and that's what the English were going to send them. So they ended up with that gauge. The L&N has started as like 6-foot gauge, decided 5-foot was perfect. So they became 5-foot gauge, which for years was called also Southern gauge because most railroads south of the Ohio River were 5-foot gauge. What did they share in common? None of them had a physical connection with the other one. And that's pretty well true through a good part of the United States. Railroads did not connect with each other. This was going to cause a problem later on. The 2 key players in the drama was James Guthrie, sometimes called Mr. Louisville. Guthrie took over as president of the L&N Railroad and actually got it finished. It was kind of mired in a lot of difficulties, and Guthrie was an organizational man. He was Secretary of the Treasury under President Franklin Pierce. So, you know, he knew his way around. He got the railroad built. He stole the best engineers from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, like I'm talking about civil engineers, and he built the bridges and the rail and locomotives. He stole the Baltimore and Ohio's chief locomotive guy also. Guthrie also founded what would lead to the University of Louisville. He also got Louisville made a city. Before that, it was a town. He got the legislature to count Louisville as the first city in Kentucky. General William Tecumseh Sherman. We've always heard a lot of stories about Sherman. Sherman first showed up in Louisville at the beginning of the war. I never figured out he had some medical or mental difficulties, whatever it was. He kind of disappeared for a while, but then came back serving under General Grant in the West. But these are the 2 key players. By the time our story starts, Sherman is now taking over from General Grant in charge of the Western theater of war. Okay, April of 1862. Decided we need to connect with the river. So a railroad track was laid north on 10th Street to the entrance to the canal. And I believe one of the reasons that was picked was there's a little wharf or indentation there at the canal, and that was used for 100 years or more as different types of unloading points, sand works, all kinds of stuff. And so they were able to, they could bring boats and barges in there without interfering with the canal and transfer goods. However, that had its own difficulties. This is a letter to the editor of the Daily Democrat, and I just excerpted a few things from this. A public nuisance at the intersection of Main and 10th Streets. Many vehicles have been broken, teams stalled, and animals crippled as a result of the careless manner in which the crossings have been constructed. Signed, a taxpayer. Anybody know a taxpayer by George? And that appeared in the Louisville paper on April 28th, 1862. So, you know, it was not a happy thing. The LNN also had problems with it. They needed the rail. Confederate guerrillas were constantly cutting the rails south of Louisville, burning bridges, trying to destroy tunnels, anything they could. And the rail that was being used there could more effectively be used in repairs. So the rail, it didn't last very long. Apparently, Mr. Taxpayer got his way. Okay, so why all this stuff? Well, the Union Army managed to get to Chattanooga. And what they did was very successful there for a while. They defeated the Confederates and moved to into Georgia, and at a little place called Chickamauga, which has some really nice monuments if you're ever down there. They met the Confederate Army under General Braxton Bragg, the same guy who was going to destroy the canal in Louisville. But anyway, Bragg was a little bit more successful there, and he beat the living tar out of the Union Army, and they retreated back to Chattanooga. If anybody's ever been to Chattanooga, ever been to Lookout Mountain, if it's a clear day, which is about half the time, you can look down on to what was in the city of Chattanooga and almost see every little thing that was going on in that town. Well, the Confederates occupied Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, and they could see everything that went on in Chattanooga. Not only that, they cut all the supply lines going in, except for one bridge, and which the soldiers called the cracker line, because they brought crackers in for rations, and that was the only supply they had. So you had a Union Army trapped in a bend of the river under complete control from above of the Confederate Army, and their supplies cut down to a trickle. So something had to be done. So what they ended up doing was they decided they needed help. Grant needed help from the Army of the Potomac. That was the one that Bernie Kopinski was really talking about, was the Army of the Potomac. Okay, what they did was the numbers vary. I came up with 20,000 because it's generally close to what different things said. The Army was moved. Now this with horses and all the stuff that goes with horses, with all the cannons, ammunition, food, everything else, was transferred from the Army of the Potomac from the east to Chattanooga. They had to ride on railroads of 3 different gauges. They started off in Washington, D.C., then ended up, well, in the Washington area, ended up on the B&O, which was standard gauge. They marched through cities from depot to depot because the railroads didn't connect. Like in Indianapolis, they had to detrain, march across Indianapolis, get on another train. Fortunately, they had, like in Indianapolis, they had the soldiers' home, which I figured was sort of a cross between a transient barracks, for traveling soldiers, and a USO. Whatever it was, they fed them there, and they did. They had it all set up. Originally, the Army wanted to take over the railroads, but the railroad said, "No, wait a minute, we can do this." And so the B&O Railroad, some others got together and coordinated the whole thing and managed to get it going. They marched across the Ohio River twice. I said marched across. They marched on pontoon bridges. There were no bridges anywhere across the Ohio River to where they could were useful to them. So they had pontoon bridges, like the one in Louisville was approximately where the Big Four bridge is now. I have no idea where the one up in West Virginia, Parkersburg, they marched across those bridges. They had problems in Ohio because Ohio had a lot of Confederate sympathizers, especially, at least they believed they did. And so they thought they were going to harass the troops as they came through Ohio. Nothing happened that way. There was no problems whatsoever. Some of the officers, you know how those officers are, they get privileges. They got off the train, visited their relatives, and then picked back up again in Louisville. They figured it, they had it all figured out. But anyway, they finally made it here where they could board trains and then be taken south. Okay, they got to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and one of the stories is, and it's probably true, is they were not planning the attack on Lookout Mountain. There was other operations going on. The soldiers were there in a holding pattern. I think they finally got tired of it. And on their own, the soldiers began moving up and attacking Lookout Mountain. And once they figured out, hey, we better do something to support these guys, they followed and they ran the Confederates off. And between that and taking Missionary Ridge, now Chattanooga was in Union hands and they could move south. Enough that. How did that affect Louisville? What about a railroad and all this sort of thing? Well, they immediately saw the advantages they had when they moved all those troops there. They also saw all the disadvantages of trying, and there's a weak link in that. They couldn't get trains across the Ohio River, but they sure could get them through Louisville a lot easier. So what they did was, first thing they did was they widened the gauge on the Louisville to Lexington Railroad to 5-foot gauge, so it would match the L&N. Then they extended the track 1 block west to First Street. In spring of 1864, I tried to pin this down, but there's not a lot. That's why this was a forgotten railroad, to be honest. There's a lot of things you can't find out. Anyway, the mayor of the city was told that there was workmen tearing up the street at First and Main. So he goes charging up there, as mayors sometimes do, and he says, by what authority are you doing this? And the foreman said, by the authority, sir, of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. And that kind of shut the mayor down because the army, they were going to come first. So they started tearing the street up to build a railway. They went to the L&N Railroad to operate, and Guthrie said, I can't do it. I have there's too many other things going on. I just can't do that. Sherman agreed with him and said, okay, they started the military railroad and here. Now, this was different. The one that Bernie talked about was they would normally move into Confederate areas, take over the railroads, rebuild them, and operate them as the U.S. military railroad. And that's what you see in this particular picture. This was different in the fact that this was one that actually was built and operated in Union territory under an organization affiliated with the U.S. military railroad. This is a map showing the railroad through the city. We'll look at it a little bit more detail as we get into it. You can see that the loop at the top of the map, you can barely say it says Louisville on it. That's the ferry route for the ferry boats between Jeffersonville and Louisville. They came in at 2nd Street. They had to cross Bear Grass Creek at that time, still came into the river. Some of it did at 2nd and River. So there was warehouses built there, and the track was run south on 1st Street across to Oak Street, and it crossed north of Patty's Run Ditch or Patty's Run Creek, or they also called it Dutch Ditch, which was a fairly large creek that ran through the center just south of downtown. And there's lots of good stuff in there. South of that was Taylor Barracks, which was a Union Army barracks there. And there was defenses and trench lines and everything else around there. At the wharf, you can see there, it crossed there. The line you see, it's in Main Street, the railroad that seems to run east and west. That started out as the Louisville end of the Lexington and Ohio Railroad, which didn't get anywhere, and it was taken over as a street railway. So there's really no connection between them. One's a street railway, the other's a steam railroad. And you can get a better picture here of the track as it moves north of Patty's Run Ditch and tied into the L&N. It also had to clear those entrenchments that had been put in there in 1862. It's kind of a modern picture of kind of way the railroad would go if looking at it today. On the Jeffersonville side, they ran a track down Wall Street to the ferry landing. And as far as I know, I don't know whether they were horse-drawn down there or what. But anyway, as far as operations went, it had to be dual gauge track. Now, this is the approach to the K&I Bridge when the New Albany Railway streetcars came across the bridge. They were 5-foot gauge. This is the only practical way you can have a dual gauge track. You can't have a third rail. There's not enough room to put a third rail in next to it with 4-foot, 8.5-inch track and a third rail. You're talking about what? 3.5 inches maybe at the most. So anyway, normally a gauntlet type track. In other words, offset a 5-foot track laid on the same ties as a 4-foot, 8.5-inch track. And I'm sure this is what they did on First Street.
Go back to that slide, please. So what you're saying is if we count from left to right on here, like the either set of tracks, like on the left, if you count 1, 2, 3, 4 rails, one gauge was using 1 and 3, and the other gauge was using 2 and 4. Is that what
Something like that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, because they couldn't put them too close together, and then they crossed, and then they came off there at Portland Avenue.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we looked at where they came off.
We've been there.
Yeah, we've been there. There's still an abutment there where they came off to Portland Avenue. Okay, the locomotives. 3 locomotives were sold by the L&N. They were all 440s. This is a picture of one by the same manufacturer that made the locomotives that went to the military railroad. Closest I could get to what they probably looked like. You can see the numbers 14, 15, and 17. And back then, all locomotives had names as well as numbers. And so they kept the same numbers apparently with the military railroad. They had a problem. They talked about it First Street. The railroad, the Lexington, the locomotive bringing cars on there had a hard time making the turn. And they had to modify the engine. I have no idea how. I have a feeling they took the front trucks off of it, maybe used it as an 040 or something like that, because they just turned a street railway type radius there in the street to get from Jefferson Street to First Street. So it just said that they had problems with it and had to do some modifications. This is a picture obviously from the 1890s from the Big Four Bridge, but it gives you an idea of what the ferry landing looked like. That's the Louisville ferry there, what it looked like. So the cars had to be brought down the second bank or the embankment down to the river level. I would imagine they probably use steam donkey engines or something of that nature, like winches to lower them up and down the track. It would sound more practical than doing it by hand. Besides the Army, they had lots of money. they wanted. This is a very fanciful picture that appeared in a clippings file. And this is probably not the way they did it. They had rails on barges, and they did put the rolling stock on the barges. I read somewhere where they dismantled the locomotives and brought them over and then put them back together again. They could have done that in Jeffersonville at the shops, and they definitely could have done it at the L&N shops in Louisville. So it's not that hard to have done. There was a steep grade from First Street, from the river up to on First Street up to Main Street. The building you're looking at on your right there is the second Galt House. And which the one down is now the third Galt House is down on the river. But anyway, there was another steep grade from Jefferson Street to Chestnut. I thought it was interesting. No, we're not standing on our head here. For some reason, this is another Army map, and they showed it facing south, or instead of a north arrow, I guess they had a south arrow on the map. What it did was, I guess it gave them a map orientation as if you were coming from the river. I never, it's the only one I've seen like this, but it's the most detailed also. The building in the top portion of the picture, I don't think it's the original building it was there, but the old buildings that were there looked the same. That was at Arterman slave pens. So this was a slave dealer. So here's all this union stuff. I think it's ironic. They're passing in front of the slave pen, which was probably still in business at the time, because slavery was not illegal in the North, only in the Confederate, not even in the Confederate States by this time. I don't think it was yet either. They had not signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And it also passed the first firehouse in the city of Louisville, which in this little thing you can read, it says it's still there. Well, it's not now. It's underneath the I-65 across the street from Aaron's trade school. And that, but anyway, that was the original firehouse. The little wooden fireman is still there. He used to be at the Speed Museum. It had to have double track somewhere. I'm assuming, and assuming gets you in trouble, as Russ usually says, but anyway, that the double track at least was on the diagonal area. And also there had to be a car hoist somewhere. This was dual gauge track, probably back up to the shops. And there they had a car hoist. And what you would do there is you would lift the car up, you would change out the trucks under it. Now, when they did this permanently in the after the Civil War further north, and after 1870, they had a steam crane that operated this, and they could change a car's trucks out in 4 minutes. I don't think they were that quick then, but they could have been. So it's not, it's very labor intensive, but not as hard a job as you think it might be. They had other problems getting down over to into Alabama and into Georgia. They had to repair bridges. This was the bridge. It says at Bridgeport, and you can see that they did a pretty good number on that bridge. Of course, so when it was put in, now you had a continuous railroad all the way to Atlanta. Did things go wrong? Yes. The guy who told about this was listed in the paper as Old Timer. So Old Timer said that, yeah, there was accidents and the kitchen was capsized. He said the cook was fixing breakfast. Now, a lot of times the kitchens were separate from the house, but maybe it wasn't. Anyway, it was at First and Broadway is where this happened at. And the train jumped the tracks and demolished the kitchen. Fortunately, the cook had taken breakfast into the house. So they each had breakfast and the cook was there to cook another day. But you can imagine these trains were running up and down that track all night long. Probably not always using the best language in the world. A lot of cursing and things, and people complained about that. And whistles, hooting and hollering. So this all day and all night, these trains are running up and down First Street. So it's been quite a mess. Traffic had began to diminish in the spring of 1865. What came north, wounded and civilians, because as Sherman got further into Georgia, he started having lots of mouths to feed. So he said, load them on trains and send them north. And I'm talking about civilians. Plus, they were all causing problems anyway, because they obviously didn't care for Union Army coming through the middle of Georgia. They said, well, where are we going to send them? He said, I don't care where you send them. Just get them out of here. So they sent all these people north and dumped them. So they showed up on trains and no refugee camp set up or anything. Just get them out of here. I don't want to look at them. So he sent them on north. And finally, it ceased altogether sometime in the summer of 1865. So there were some proposals that, hey, we could turn this into a street railroad. We could do this, we could do that. And they said, no, you're not going to do that. So in September of 1866, Jeffersonville moved the track from Pearl Street west over to Wall Street. I think that's right. And it stayed there for many years. The government reimbursed the city of Louisville $12,500. That doesn't sound like very much money. That's millions of dollars in today's money for the rebuilding of First Street from Fulton Street, which is at the river, to Kentucky Street, where that was torn up by the military railroad. And let's see. Okay, one last thing. Okay. General Sherman made a comment that he was amused to see cars from the northern railroads. And he mentioned Baltimore and Ohio and other rails in deepest Georgia, which was unheard of before this railroad ran through First Street in Louisville. It would never happen. But you began seeing, the other problem they had was they would send cars south and not send them back north. And Guthrie went to him and said, I need cars, send my cars back. And Sherman said, well, what am I going to do? He said, where are you getting all these cars from the north? Keep them. So that's what they did. But they kept the northern cars. And eventually, if you know anything about Sherman, he eventually, once he took Atlanta, he cut all communications and lived off the land and started his famous March to the Sea, because he said he didn't want anyone to know where he was, then they couldn't tell him what to do. And so that's what because if you ever seen the movie Lincoln, anybody seen that movie? It gives you a good view of the telegraph office in Washington, D.C., and how Abraham Lincoln could micromanage the war in 1860s. It could really be, he didn't need the internet, he had the telegraph. Okay, and that's it. Is there any questions?